The Arizona Territory sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Prescott as Sarah McKenna clutched the court document in her trembling hands. The ink seemed to mock her from the yellowed paper, an order that would change everything about her quiet, struggling existence. "Mrs. McKenna," Judge Harrison's voice had boomed in the cramped courthouse just an hour earlier, "the territorial government has determined that you will provide 3 daily meals to the Apache prisoner, Ayanna, as part of his supervised custody arrangement. You will be compensated 50 cents per week from territorial funds." Sarah had stared at the judge in disbelief, her worn cotton dress suddenly feeling too tight around her chest. "Your Honor, I don't understand. Why me?" The judge's weathered face had remained impassive. "Your boarding house is the closest suitable establishment to the holding facility. The decision is final." Now standing outside the courthouse in the blazing afternoon heat, Sarah felt the weight of the entire town's stares. Word traveled fast in Prescott, and already she could see the disapproving glances from the shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, the whispered conversations between the women gathered near the general store. Mrs. Hutchinson, the banker's wife, approached with a face pinched tight as a dried apple. "Sarah McKenna, surely you're not going through with this madness. Feeding one of those savages, it's unnatural, unseemly." "It's a court order, Mrs. Hutchinson," Sarah replied quietly, folding the document carefully. "I don't have a choice." "There's always a choice," the older woman sniffed. "Pack up and leave town. No decent Christian woman should be forced to—" "I can't leave," Sarah interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "This is my home. My husband built this life for us before—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence about Tom's death 2 years prior. The boarding house stood at the edge of town like a weathered sentinel, its paint peeling and shutters hanging slightly askew. Sarah had managed to keep it running after Tom's passing, but barely. The 50 cents a week would help, even if it came with an impossible burden. Inside the dim interior, dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light, streaming through cracked windows. The common room held a few mismatched tables and chairs, while the kitchen beyond showed signs of careful maintenance, despite its age. This had been her sanctuary, her refuge from the harsh realities of frontier life. A heavy knock on the front door made her jump. Through the window she could see Marshal Davidson's distinctive silver badge catching the sunlight. Beside him stood a figure that made her breath catch in her throat. The Apache warrior was not what she had expected. Tall and lean, with bronze skin weathered by sun and wind, he wore simple canvas pants and a cotton shirt, rather than the war paint and feathers she had imagined. His long black hair was tied back with a leather cord, and his dark eyes held an intelligence that surprised her. Most startling of all, there were no chains, no visible restraints. "Mrs. McKenna," Marshal Davidson tipped his hat. "This is Ayanna. He'll be here at sunrise, noon, and sunset for his meals. The arrangement is to continue indefinitely." Ayanna stepped forward, his movements fluid and confident despite his circumstances. When he spoke, his English was clear and measured. "I understand this is not your choice, Mrs. McKenna. I will cause no trouble." Sarah found herself staring into eyes that held no malice, only a quiet resignation that mirrored her own feelings. The meals will be ready at the appointed times." "Good," the marshal nodded. "Any problems? You send word immediately." He turned to Ayanna. "Remember what we discussed. Any sign of trouble, and you'll be back in the territorial prison faster than you can blink." As the marshal walked away, leaving them alone on the porch, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Sarah became acutely aware of how isolated her boarding house was, how few neighbors were within shouting distance. "You are afraid," Ayanna observed, not accusingly, but as a simple statement of fact. Sarah lifted her chin. "I'm cautious, there's a difference." For the first time, something that might have been a smile flickered across his features. "Yes, there is." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Sarah realized that within hours she would be serving her first meal to an Apache warrior, a man whose people were locked in brutal conflict with her own. The absurdity and danger of the situation suddenly hit her full force. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why this arrangement? Why not the prison?" Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Your government believes I have information they want. They think comfort might loosen my tongue." "Do you have information?" His dark eyes met hers. "What would you do with such knowledge, Mrs. McKenna?" The question hung between them like smoke from a campfire, and Sarah realized that her simple life was about to become far more complicated than she had ever imagined. Tomorrow would bring the first meal, the first real test of whether a white widow and an Apache warrior could coexist even temporarily in a world determined to keep them as enemies. As Ayanna turned and walked back toward town, Sarah watched his retreating figure and wondered if she had just looked into the eyes of her salvation or her doom. Dawn came with a chill that made Sarah's breath visible as she worked in the kitchen, preparing what felt like the most important meal of her life. Her hands shook slightly as she sliced the salt pork, the knife making sharp sounds against the wooden cutting board. She had barely slept, her mind racing with questions and fears about what this day would bring. The knock came precisely at sunrise, measured and respectful. When she opened the door, Ayanna stood waiting with the same quiet dignity he had shown the day before. In the morning light, she noticed details she had missed: the thin scar along his left temple, the calloused hands that spoke of hard work, the way he held himself with perfect posture despite his circumstances. "Good morning, Mrs. McKenna." "Good morning," she replied, stepping aside to let him enter. "The meal is ready." She had set a place at the small table near the kitchen, uncertain of the protocol for such an unusual arrangement. Ayanna paused in the doorway, taking in the modest interior with careful eyes before moving to the designated seat. The breakfast was simple: salt pork, cornbread, and black coffee. Sarah placed the plate before him and retreated to the kitchen doorway, unsure whether she should sit, leave, or watch. The silence stretched uncomfortably. "Will you not eat?" Ayanna asked, looking up from his untouched meal. I wasn't sure what was expected." "I am not an animal in a cage, Mrs. McKenna. If it pleases you to sit, then sit." Sarah took the chair across from him, her own plate containing a much smaller portion. As Ayanna began to eat, she noticed his careful, deliberate movements. There was nothing savage or crude about his manner. He ate with more dignity than half the cowboys who had passed through her boarding house. "This is good bread," he said after a few bites. "You made it yourself?" "Yes, my husband taught me. He was a baker before we came west. He is dead." The directness of the question should have offended her, but something in his tone, a recognition of loss rather than mere curiosity, made it bearable. 2 years ago, fever took him. Ayanna nodded slowly. "My wife died of the white man's spotted fever. 3 winters passed." The admission hung between them, a bridge of shared grief that neither had expected. Sarah found herself looking at him with new eyes, not just as an Apache warrior, but as a man who had loved and lost. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "as am I for your loss." They finished the meal in a different kind of silence, one less charged with fear and more touched with mutual understanding. When Ayanna rose to leave, he paused at the door. "The bread was very good, Mrs. McKenna. Thank you." By noon, word had spread through Prescott like wildfire. When Ayanna returned for his second meal, a small crowd had gathered across the street, watching the boarding house with hostile eyes. Sarah served him beef stew and biscuits, trying to ignore the faces pressed against her windows. "They are angry," Ayanna observed, cutting his meat with precise movements. "They're afraid," Sarah corrected. "We've lost many people to raids, to war. As have we." The simple statement carried the weight of generations of conflict. Sarah thought of the stories she had heard: whole Apache villages destroyed, families torn apart, children taken from their parents. She had never considered that the enemy might grieve their losses too. "Why did you come here?" she asked. "To Arizona, I mean. Why not stay with your people?" Ayanna was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a deep weariness. "My people are scattered. Some follow Geronimo into the mountains, always running, always fighting. Others go to the reservation, where they slowly die of broken spirits. I chose a different path." "What path is that?" "Survival, learning, understanding the world that has swallowed ours." The crowd outside had grown larger by the time he prepared to leave. Sarah watched through the window as he walked calmly through their midst, ignoring the muttered curses and hostile stares. Not one person dared to confront him directly, she noticed. There was something about his bearing that commanded a reluctant respect. The evening meal brought unexpected drama. As Sarah served venison and potatoes, the last of her good meat, angry voices erupted outside. Through the window she could see torches bobbing in the growing darkness. "McKenna!" a rough voice shouted. "Come out here!" Sarah's blood ran cold. She recognized the voice of Jake Morrison, a local rancher whose brother had been killed in an Apache raid the previous spring. Ayanna remained seated, but his posture had shifted slightly, ready for action. "Stay inside," he said quietly. "It's my house," Sarah replied, but her voice betrayed her fear. The front door rattled under heavy pounding. "We know you got that savage in there. This ain't right, woman. Ain't natural." More voices joined in, a chorus of anger and righteous indignation. Sarah could see perhaps a dozen men, some carrying rifles, all wearing expressions of barely controlled rage. Ayanna stood slowly, moving away from the window. "Where is your back door?" "You can't run. They'll hunt you down." "I do not run, but I will not bring more trouble to your home." Before Sarah could respond, the front door burst open. Jake Morrison stormed in, followed by 3 other men, all reeking of whiskey and violence. They pulled up short when they saw Ayanna standing calmly in the center of the room, making no move toward a weapon. "Well, well," Morrison sneered. "The noble savage, taking charity from a white woman. You got no shame, McKenna?" "Get out of my house," Sarah said, finding her voice despite her terror. "You have no right." "We got every right," Morrison spat. "This is a white town, and we don't take kindly to Apache scum eating at our tables." Ayanna stepped forward, and the men instinctively reached for their guns. "I am here, by order of your court, your law. If you have complaint, take it to your judge. The only law for your kind is a rope," one of the other men growled. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Sarah realized that violence was only heartbeats away, and that her small boarding house might become the site of bloodshed that would destroy any chance of peace in the valley. "Please," she said, stepping between the men and Ayanna. "He's done nothing wrong. He's been respectful, quiet. The court's run by Eastern fools who never seen what these animals can do," Morrison interrupted. "But we have. We remember." For a moment, Sarah thought they might attack anyway, law or no law. Then Ayanna spoke, his voice carrying an unexpected authority. "I knew your brother, Morrison. He was brave in death. He fought well." The words hit Morrison like a physical blow. His face went white, then red with rage. "You son of a—" "He died as a warrior should, with honor. Do not shame his memory with cowardice." The other men held Morrison back as he lunged forward, but Ayanna hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. His calm demeanor in the face of such hatred was more unsettling to the mob than any show of violence could have been. "This ain't over," Morrison snarled as his friends dragged him toward the door. "Court order or no court order, we'll be watching. You remember that, savage." After they left, Sarah found herself shaking uncontrollably. Ayanna moved to the window, watching the torches disappear into the night. "I should not have spoken of his brother," he said quietly. "But truth is sometimes the only weapon against hatred. Will they come back? Perhaps, but not tonight. They are not yet drunk enough for murder." Sarah sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the day's events. She had expected difficulty, but not outright hostility from her own neighbors. The reality of her situation was becoming clear. She was now caught between 2 worlds, trusted by neither, protected by none, save a court order that might prove as fragile as morning frost. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry they said those things." Ayanna turned from the window, and in the lamplight, his expression was gentler than she had yet seen. "Do not apologize for their fear, Mrs. McKenna. Fear makes animals of us all." As he prepared to leave, Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer simply captor and captive, or even strangers bound by legal obligation. They were 2 people who had shared a meal and faced danger together, however briefly. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, for the first time since Tom's death, Sarah McKenna did not feel entirely alone in the world. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation with Morrison's mob, and an uneasy routine had settled over Sarah's boarding house. The townspeople still watched with suspicious eyes, but no one had dared to challenge the court order again. Sarah found herself looking forward to the meals in ways that surprised and troubled her. Ayanna arrived each day with the same quiet dignity, and their conversations had gradually expanded beyond polite necessities. She learned that he could read English as well as speak it, that he had traveled as far as California with trading parties, and that he possessed a deep knowledge of the desert that seemed almost mystical to her Eastern sensibilities. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek in shades of gold, Ayanna arrived carrying something wrapped in soft buckskin. "Good morning, Mrs. McKenna. I have brought something for you." Sarah paused in setting out the breakfast plates, surprised. In all their weeks together, he had never brought anything except his presence and careful manners. That's not necessary. The court arrangement doesn't require—" "It is not for the court," he interrupted gently. "It is because you have shown kindness to a man your people consider an enemy." He unwrapped the buckskin to reveal a necklace unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Delicate silver work formed intricate patterns around small turquoise stones that seemed to capture and hold the morning light. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of a master artisan. "I can't accept this," Sarah breathed, though her fingers itched to touch the beautiful piece. "It's too valuable to—" "It belonged to my wife," Ayana said quietly. "She would want it to adorn someone who understands what it means to keep a home with grace, even when the world offers only hardship." The comparison to his deceased wife should have felt inappropriate, yet somehow it seemed the highest compliment he could offer. Sarah looked up into his dark eyes and saw something that made her heart race, a warmth that had nothing to do with mere gratitude. "I don't know what to say." "Say you will wear it, if it pleases you." With trembling fingers, Sarah took the necklace. The silver was warm to the touch, as if it held the memory of the woman who had worn it before. As she fastened it around her neck, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. The turquoise brought out the blue in her eyes, and for the first time in years, she saw herself as something other than just a struggling widow. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "as are you." The words hung between them, too honest and dangerous to take back. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, a flush of pleasure and confusion that she hadn't experienced since her courtship with Tom. Their breakfast passed in a different kind of silence than usual, not uncomfortable but charged with new awareness. Sarah found herself stealing glances at Ayana's hands as he ate, noticing the graceful way he moved, the quiet strength in his gestures. "Mrs. McKenna," he said as the meal ended, "I would ask something of you." "What is it?" "My name is not truly Ayana. Your people gave me this name because they could not pronounce my real one. In my language, I am called Naalnish." "It means he works hard." Sarah tested the unfamiliar sounds. Naalnish. He smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "Yes, very good. Then you must call me Sarah. Mrs. McKenna sounds so formal after what you've shared with me." "Sarah," he repeated, and somehow her name sounded different on his lips, more musical than she remembered. The noon meal brought unexpected visitors. Marshal Davidson arrived with a well-dressed stranger, a man in an expensive suit who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mrs. McKenna, this is Mr. Blackwood from the territorial capital. He has some questions for our Apache friend here." Blackwood's pale eyes swept over Sarah's modest home with obvious disdain before settling on the turquoise necklace she wore. His expression sharpened with interest and suspicion. "Interesting jewelry, Mrs. McKenna. Quite valuable, I'd imagine." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to the necklace. It was a gift. From him, no doubt. Blackwood nodded toward Ayana, who sat calmly eating his meal despite the scrutiny, curious that a prisoner would have such wealth to give away. "The arrangement allows him to dine here," Marshal Davidson said carefully. Nothing was said about gifts. Blackwood pulled out a chair and sat uninvited across from Ayana. "Where did you get the silver and turquoise for such a piece, Apache?" "It belonged to my wife," Ayana replied without looking up from his food. "And where did she acquire it? Stolen from some raid, perhaps? Taken from the body of a murdered settler?" Sarah felt anger flare in her chest. "How dare you suggest—" "Mrs. McKenna," Blackwood's voice was ice-cold, "you would do well to remember that you are harboring a known associate of Geronimo. Every piece of jewelry, every coin he possesses likely came at the cost of American blood." Ayana finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting Blackwood's pale ones without flinching. "My wife was Apache. She made the necklace herself, with silver traded honestly from Mexican merchants and turquoise gathered from sacred places in the mountains. No blood stains it, but that of her hands when she cut herself on the tools. How convenient that she's not here to verify that story. She is dead because your soldiers brought disease to our winter camp. She is dead because your people cannot tell the difference between warriors and families. Do not speak of her with disrespect." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying Ayana with the calculating gaze of a man who made his living reading other people's weaknesses. "You're very protective of her memory. As protective, perhaps, as you are of the location of Geronimo's gold cache." Sarah's breath caught. She had heard rumors about Apache gold, stories of hidden treasures from raids, silver and coins buried in secret locations throughout the territory, but she had dismissed them as frontier fantasies. Ayana's expression didn't change. I know nothing of any gold. Come now, Blackwood smiled without warmth. We both know Geronimo's band has been raiding supply trains and settlements for years. All that wealth doesn't simply disappear. Someone knows where it's hidden. If such wealth existed, do you think I would be here, eating at the charity of the territorial government? It was a fair point, and Sarah could see Blackwood's frustration at the logical response. The government man stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. This arrangement won't last forever, Apache. Eventually you'll be sent to the reservation in Florida with the rest of your kind. When that happens, any chance of recovering what your people have stolen dies with you. Then you will be disappointed, Ayanna said simply. After the men left, Sarah found herself studying her dining companion with new eyes. The necklace around her throat suddenly felt heavier, more significant. Could it really be made from stolen treasure? And if so, what did that make her? An accomplice to crimes she couldn't even imagine. Naalnish, she said carefully. The necklace. Is it truly what you said? He was quiet for a long moment, his meal forgotten. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to age him before her eyes. My wife, Desba, was the finest silversmith among our people. She learned the craft from her grandmother, who learned it from the Mexican artisans who traded with us in the old days, before the wars. Every piece she made was created with her own hands, from materials we gathered or traded for honestly. But Blackwood seemed so certain about the gold. There are many stories about Apache gold, Sarah. Some true, some false, all dangerous. The truth is that Geronimo's band has taken many things in their raids. Food, weapons, horses, yes, sometimes silver and coin. But the great treasure your government believes we possess, he shook his head. It is mostly legend, grown large in the telling. Mostly? Ayanna met her eyes and she saw something there that made her pulse quicken. Trust, vulnerability, and perhaps something deeper. There is gold, Sarah. Not the vast hoard your people imagine, but enough, hidden where only a few know to find it. I am one of those few. The admission hung between them like a bridge across a chasm, dangerous to cross, impossible to ignore. Sarah realized that he had just trusted her with information that could cost him his life, information that men like Blackwood would kill for. Why are you telling me this? Because you gave me something I had forgotten existed, kindness without expectation. Because in 3 weeks of meals together, you have never once asked me what they all want to know. Because, he paused, seeming to gather courage, because I find myself caring what you think of me. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She was walking into territory more dangerous than any Apache raid, more treacherous than any desert crossing. She was falling in love with a man her world considered an enemy, and he had just confessed to possessing the very treasure that could save her failing boarding house or get them both killed. Naalnish, she whispered. What are we doing? I do not know, Sarah, but I find I do not wish to stop. As the afternoon sun slanted through her windows, casting long shadows across the simple room, Sarah McKenna realized that her life had just taken a turn from which there would be no going back. The necklace around her throat was more than a gift. It was a promise, a declaration, and perhaps a death sentence, all wrapped in silver and stone. November brought the first frost to the Arizona mountains, and with it a change in the atmosphere around Prescott that had nothing to do with weather. Sarah noticed it in the way conversations stopped when she passed on the street, in the increasingly hostile stares from women who had once been cordial neighbors. The turquoise necklace, which she now wore every day, seemed to burn against her skin like a brand, marking her as something other than respectable. The morning meal had become the highlight of her day, a fact that both thrilled and terrified her. Naalnish arrived as always at sunrise, but now their conversations flowed with an intimacy that made her forget, sometimes for whole minutes, that he was supposed to be her enemy. The first snow will come soon, he observed, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. In the high country it may have already begun. Will your people be safe? Sarah asked, settling across from him with her own cup. She had stopped pretending this was merely a business arrangement weeks ago. Those still free know how to survive winter. They have done so for countless generations. His expression grew distant, but each year grows harder. Game becomes scarce, safe places fewer. The young ones grow tired of running. Is that why you chose this path, because you were tired of running? Naalnish studied her face as if memorizing it. I chose this path because I saw that our old way of life was ending, no matter how fiercely we fought. I thought if I could understand your people better, perhaps I could find a way for mine to survive in the world that is coming. And have you found a way? "I have found something I did not expect," he said softly. "I have found that some bridges can be built, even across the deepest chasms." The weight of his words settled between them, and Sarah felt her breath catch. They were speaking in metaphors, but the meaning was clear enough to make her pulse race. "Naalnish," she began, but the sound of approaching horses cut her off. Through the window, she could see Marshal Davidson riding up with two other men, one she recognized as Mr. Blackwood, the other a stranger in military uniform. The sight of the blue cavalry jacket made her stomach clench with worry. "Stay calm," Naalnish murmured, his hand briefly covering hers on the table. The touch lasted only a second, but it sent warmth shooting up her arm. The men entered without knocking, Blackwood leading the way with his usual air of entitled authority. The cavalry officer was younger, with the bearing of someone trying hard to prove his competence to his superiors. "Mrs. McKenna, I trust you remember me," Blackwood said, removing his hat but not bothering with pleasantries. "This is Captain Morrison, recently transferred from Fort Apache." Sarah's blood turned cold. "Morrison?" "Jake Morrison's my cousin," the captain confirmed, his pale eyes fixing on Naalnish with unconcealed hatred. "I've heard interesting reports about the arrangements here." Marshal Davidson looked uncomfortable. "Captain Morrison is here on official business, Mrs. McKenna. New orders from the territorial governor." Blackwood produced a document from his coat. "The Apache prisoner is to be transferred to military custody effective immediately. He'll be taken to Fort Apache for enhanced interrogation regarding the location of stolen goods and the movements of hostile bands." "Enhanced interrogation?" Sarah stood so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. "What does that mean?" "It means we're done playing games," Captain Morrison said, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "It means this savage is going to tell us what we want to know one way or another." Naalnish remained seated, but Sarah could see the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had shifted to rest flat on the table, ready to move if necessary. "The court order," Sarah began, "has been superseded by military authority," Blackwood interrupted. "The civilian government has determined that national security takes precedence over local arrangements." "This is wrong," Sarah said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "He's done nothing to violate the terms of his custody. He's been peaceful, respectful. He's been charming you, Mrs. McKenna," Captain Morrison said with a cold smile. "It's what his kind do. They seduce vulnerable women, gain their trust, use them for information and supplies. Look at yourself, wearing Apache jewelry, defending a known associate of Geronimo. You've been completely taken in." Heat flamed in Sarah's cheeks. "How dare you suggest—" "Enough!" Naalnish's voice cut through the argument like a blade. He stood slowly, his movements controlled and dignified despite the circumstances. "I will come with you. There is no need for further conflict." "No!" The word burst from Sarah's lips before she could stop it. All four men turned to stare at her, and she realized how completely she had just revealed her feelings. "I mean, this is highly irregular. Surely there are proper procedures." Blackwood's eyes glittered with interest. "Mrs. McKenna, you seem unusually invested in the welfare of this prisoner. Perhaps you've grown too attached to your arrangement." The insinuation was clear, and Sarah felt her world tilt on its axis. In the space of 5 minutes, her reputation had been destroyed, her heart broken and her future shattered. "Sarah," Naalnish said quietly, using her first name in front of the officials without shame, "do not make this harder than it must be. You have shown me more kindness than I deserved, that is enough." But it wasn't enough, and they both knew it. 3 months of shared meals had become something neither of them had intended, a connection that transcended the boundaries of race, culture, and circumstance. Now those boundaries were snapping back into place with brutal force. Captain Morrison stepped forward, his hand on his weapon. "Let's go, Apache. You've caused enough trouble here." As Naalnish moved toward the door, he paused beside Sarah. For a moment she thought he might speak, might offer some word of comfort or hope. Instead, he simply reached into his shirt and withdrew a small object wrapped in leather. "For your kindness," he said, pressing it into her palm. "Remember that not all gifts come with chains attached." Before she could unwrap it, he was gone, walking between the marshal and the captain with the same quiet dignity he had shown that first day. Sarah watched from her doorway as they mounted their horses, watched as the man she had come to love was taken away to face interrogation that might well kill him. Only after the dust of their departure had settled did she look at what he had given her. The leather wrapping fell away to reveal a small piece of silver, hammered flat and etched with intricate symbols. At the center was a tiny turquoise stone, no bigger than her fingernail. It took her a moment to realize what she was looking at, a map. The symbols showed landmarks, distances, directions. Hidden among the decorative patterns was information that men like Blackwood would kill for, the location of Apache gold. Sarah sank into her chair, clutching the silver map to her chest. Naalnish had not just given her treasure, he had given her a choice. She could turn the map over to the authorities, perhaps earning enough reward money to save her boarding house and restore her standing in the community. Or she could honor the trust he had placed in her, protecting the secret that was now literally in her hands. As the sun climbed higher, casting harsh light through her windows, Sarah McKenna realized that her next decision would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of the man she loved. The silver grew warm in her palm, and she understood that some choices once made could never be undone. Outside, the first snow began to fall, dusting the desert with white that would melt by noon, but the cold that had settled in Sarah's heart felt like it might last forever. 3 days passed like a lifetime. Sarah barely slept, barely ate, the silver map burning in her hands like a live coal. News filtered back from Fort Apache in whispers and fragments. The Apache prisoner was being questioned harshly. Captain Morrison was determined to break him, and so far, Naalnish had revealed nothing. On the 4th morning, as snow continued to dust the mountains, Sarah made her decision. She packed supplies into Tom's old saddlebags, food, water, blankets, and her husband's pistol. The map had revealed its secrets after hours of study. The symbols marked a location in the Superstition Mountains, a dangerous journey even for experienced riders, but Sarah had grown up on horseback in Missouri before coming west. Mrs. Hutchinson intercepted her as she led Tom's old gelding from the stable behind the boarding house. "Sarah McKenna, where do you think you're going with that horse and those supplies?" "Away from here," Sarah replied, checking the cinch on her saddle. "Away from people who think kindness is a crime and love is a sin." "Love?" Mrs. Hutchinson's voice rose to a scandalized squeak. "You can't possibly mean that's savage." Sarah turned to face the older woman, and something in her expression made Mrs. Hutchinson step back. "His name is Naalnish, and he's worth 10 of the so-called civilized men in this town. You've lost your mind. The fever of widowhood has addled your brain." "Maybe," Sarah mounted her horse with practiced ease. "But for the first time in 2 years, I'm not just surviving, I'm living." The ride to the Superstitions took the better part of a day. Sarah followed game trails and old Apache paths, the silver map guiding her through landscape that grew increasingly wild and forbidding. By late afternoon, she had reached the landmark shown on the map, a distinctive rock formation that looked like a giant's fist thrust up from the desert floor. The cache was hidden exactly where the symbols indicated, in a cave behind a curtain of prickly pear cactus. Sarah's breath caught as her lamp illuminated the contents. Leather bags filled with silver coins, ornate Mexican jewelry, and yes, gold, raw nuggets and refined pieces that represented years of successful raids. But she had not come for the treasure itself. She had come for the leverage it represented. The ride back to Prescott took all night, Sarah pushing her horse as hard as she dared. She arrived at dawn, dusty and exhausted, leading a pack horse loaded with enough wealth to ransom a dozen prisoners. Fort Apache lay 20 miles south of town, but Sarah rode straight to the territorial courthouse instead. Judge Harrison was just arriving for the day's session when she confronted him on the courthouse steps. "Your Honor, I need to speak with you about the Apache prisoner." Judge Harrison looked her up and down, taking in her travel-stained clothes and determined expression. "Mrs. McKenna, I understand your arrangement with the prisoner has been terminated. There's nothing more to discuss." "There is if I have information about Apache gold," Sarah said loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Information that certain parties would pay handsomely to obtain." The judge's eyebrows shot up. "What kind of information?" Sarah opened one of the saddlebags, revealing a glint of gold and silver that made several onlookers gasp. "The kind that comes with proof, Your Honor. I know where Geronimo's treasure is hidden." Within an hour, Sarah found herself in the judge's private chambers, with Marshal Davidson, Mr. Blackwood, and a hastily summoned Captain Morrison. The gold and silver lay spread across the judge's desk, more wealth than any of them had seen in one place. "Where did you get this?" Blackwood demanded, his pale eyes glittering with greed. "From the location marked on this," Sarah replied, placing the silver map on the desk. "Naalnish gave it to me before you took him away." Captain Morrison leaned forward eagerly. "He told you where the treasure was hidden?" "Not in words," Sarah said carefully, "but he trusted me with this map. I believe he intended it as Insurance. Insurance against what? Sarah met each man's eyes in turn. Against being tortured to death before he could reveal the information you want. He's not going to tell you anything under interrogation, gentlemen. He's Apache. He'd die first. But if you treat him with the respect he deserves, if you honor the original court arrangement, he might be willing to negotiate. Judge Harrison stroked his beard thoughtfully. What kind of negotiation? Safe passage to the reservation for himself and any of his people who wish to surrender peacefully. In exchange, he provides the locations of 3 other caches like this one. It was a lie, but a believable one. Sarah had no idea if other caches existed, but she was gambling that the men's greed would overcome their skepticism. Blackwood's fingers traced the edge of a gold nugget. And what guarantee do we have that he'll honor such an agreement? What guarantee did I have that he wouldn't kill me in my sleep these past months? Sarah countered. Some things require trust, Mr. Blackwood. Naalnish is a man of honor, even if you can't recognize it. Captain Morrison's face was red with frustration. You're asking us to negotiate with a known criminal, to treat him like an equal. I'm asking you to treat him like a human being, Sarah interrupted. And in return you get more wealth than you could squeeze out of him with all the torture in the world. The silence stretched as the men considered her proposal. Finally, Judge Harrison spoke. The prisoner will be returned to the original custody arrangement, pending further negotiations. Marshal Davidson, you'll escort him back to town immediately. Your Honor, Captain Morrison protested. My orders, your orders are now superseded by mine, the judge said firmly. And Mrs. McKenna, you'll resume providing meals as before. This treasure remains in territorial custody as evidence of good faith. By evening, Naalnish was back at Sarah's table, though the signs of his ordeal were clear in the bruises on his face and the careful way he moved. They ate in silence at first, both overwhelmed by the events of the past few days. You should not have done it, he said finally. It was too dangerous. You trusted me with that map, Sarah replied. I couldn't let that trust be for nothing. The gold, it was not meant as payment for my freedom. It was meant to give you a chance at a new life, away from this place. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, not caring who might see through the windows. There is no life for me away from this place if it doesn't include you. Naalnish's fingers tightened around hers. Sarah, you know this cannot last. Eventually they will tire of the arrangement. I will be sent to the reservation, and you, then we'll make the most of the time we have, she said simply. And when that time is over, we'll face whatever comes next together. Together? Hope flickered in his dark eyes. I've been thinking about it for days, Sarah said, her heart racing with the magnitude of what she was about to propose. The reservation isn't paradise, but it's not prison either. Families live there, build homes, raise children. If a woman were to marry an Apache man, you would do that. Leave everything you know, everyone you know. Sarah looked around her modest boarding house, then back at the man whose love had transformed her from a bitter widow into a woman who believed in the future again. I've already lost everyone who mattered to me here, she said. Everyone except you. 3 weeks later, they were married in a simple ceremony presided over by a sympathetic army chaplain. The town of Prescott buzzed with scandal, but Sarah found she no longer cared. She had discovered something more valuable than gold, more precious than respectability. She had found love that transcended every boundary her world had tried to build. As they prepared to leave for the reservation, Naalnish gave her one final gift, a small leather pouch containing seeds from the desert flowers that bloomed near his wife's grave. For the garden we will plant together, he said, in whatever soil we find ourselves. Sarah smiled, fingering the turquoise necklace that had started it all. Together, she agreed, and knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as partners, as equals, as two souls who had found each other across the vast divide of a changing world. The morning they left Prescott, riding toward their new life on the reservation, the sun painted the desert in shades of gold and hope. Behind them, the boarding house sat empty but for memories. Ahead lay uncertainty but also possibility, and in her saddlebags, wrapped carefully in silk, Sarah carried the seeds of their future, a future they would build one day, one meal, one moment of trust at a time.